Fruits of incitement. After the Capitol breach, the task of building bipartisan consensus is that much harder. If the history of nations is replete with ironies, nowhere were they more evident than in the U.S., when the greatest nation on earth became hostage to an ugly attempted coup led by a mob, bearing slogans of support for outgoing President Donald Trump. On Wednesday, hundreds of them stormed the Capitol building, as police appeared to be overwhelmed, and members of Congress, who were gathering to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, cowered behind benches or were evacuated. Although the mob was eventually ejected, lawmakers went on to reconvene and formally certify the results, and Mr. Trump narrowly committed to an orderly transition. Major social media platforms locked his accounts for violating their civic integrity policies, namely inciting violence with months of contentious posts that made baseless allegations about electoral fraud. The immediate trigger for the mob, said to have been methodically planned online via social media, was the surprise victory of two Democratic candidates, Raphael Warnock and John Osso, in the January 5 runoff election in Georgia. That election was necessitated by the fact that no candidate won 50% of the popular vote in the November 3 general election. Their win gives Democrats 50 seats in the Senate, which is tantamount to control of the upper chamber of Congress, because the incoming Vice President, Kamala Harris, will cast a deciding vote in a tie. To say that the incoming and 46th U.S. President, Joe Biden, has a tough job on his hands after his inauguration on January 20, would be an understatement. The sheer viciousness of the January 6 mob attack, and more than 2 months of hateful vitriol online and a fine following the 2020 election, is proof that political America is deeply polarized, brimming with anger and disenchantment at the ground realities. The unprecedented assault on the very soul of democracy, as Mr. Biden put it, has been in the making for more than 4 years. At the heart of the tsunami of angst that was evident throughout the election campaign is a sense of frustration that grips middle America, including the white middle class and blue-collar workers, over the inevitable changes to the U.S. economy and society. There is a view that the forces of immigration and globalization have lit the fuses on this explosive combination of racial prejudice and economic insecurity. In reality, Mr. Trump's strident rhetoric exploited this sense of alienation and socio-economic dysfunction for narrow political and personal gains. Now Mr. Biden has an opportunity to strike a more balanced note by, on the one hand, seeking to revive the moribund spirit of bipartisan consensus and expediently tackling the thorny issue of comprehensive immigration reform, and, on the other, redressing the ills of runaway free market liberalization and forging a post-COVID-19 economic vision that can truly deliver on the American dream. Reading Hannah Arendt in Joe Biden's America. With a grasp of her writings on totalitarianism and the human condition in crises, Biden could have a vision for change. For the first time in the history of the United States, a president has incited insurrection by his neo-Nazi brigade of right-wing supporters, opposing the peaceful transfer of power. It is tantamount to encouraging hostility when the world stood horried as a witness to the rioters storming the U.S. Capitol. The violence against democracy, a blotch on the American constitutional democracy, interestingly, changed the minds of senators like Kelly Loeffler, Republican, who had previously said that they would object to the Electoral College results. Healing a polarized nation, the unhinged and angry authoritarian at last stands crushed and humiliated after trying his best to undercut one of the oldest democratic systems in existence. With Joe Biden walking into the White House on January 20, there can be no overplaying the enormity of the tasks ahead of him, what with the deeply polarized nation divided into two belligerent camps. Acted with an escalating novel coronavirus pandemic, an ailing economy, racial discrimination, and a climate crisis reviewed by millions, Mr. Biden's America has 4 long years to undo the tragic consequences of intolerance and division left behind by the incumbent. Tragedy, for Joe Biden, is the very condition of life. Having lost his wife and daughter in an accident and a son to cancer, Joe Biden has always had the deep-seated desire to urge politics towards humanism in the wake of the overwhelming systemic racism that has underpinned American culture recently. The bitter assault on democracy is better understood in the recent revelation of his letter written in 1975 to the famous German-American philosopher, Hannah Arendt, requesting her to send him a copy of her paper read at the Boston Bicentennial Forum. It wreaks his desire to end deeper causes underlying the economic and social collapse as well as the scourge of racism. A contrast to Trump's politics, Arendt sent out a warning in her paper entitled Coming Home to Roost, which the present generation must heed. All speculation about deeper causes returns from the shock of reality, the stark, naked brutality of facts, of things as they are. Her focus is largely on her deep-seated interest in political humanism and a free space in the world inhabited by people who are inspired by public principles and an ethics that stands in stark contradiction to the inherent ethno-nationalist populism and alternate reality politics of Donald Trump. Boastful and deluded like Mussolini, and with an overriding penchant for self-glorification, he is overwhelmingly obsessed with not letting go of his power. More frighteningly, his conception of reality is diarrhent and facts have no significance for him. Arendt returns repeatedly to this theme of the diarrhence in things as they are and things as they can be made to seem the diarrhence, for example, in our outright humiliating defeat in Vietnam and what Americans had been led to believe would be peace with honor. The image projected by Mr. Trump of an America for the whites, where there is no place for immigrant termites, coheres with the public sentiment of the white non-college-going population that relates fondly with the language of a president that is no better than a junior school third-rater. The invasion of Mr. Trump into the political life of America has been more of a politics of lies projected through the dominance of an image to convince the people that only he could save America. And now when the shaky putsch has failed and the Trump loyalists have departed for home, he has begun to exactly do what the American government is an old hand at, ending ways and means of how to avoid admitting defeat and keeping the image of a president as the mightiest power on earth and the only one who can keep it intact. A bully is no diarrhent. In asking for the paper, Mr. Biden, to use Arendt's words with which she described President Ford's attitude after the defeat in Vietnam, has taken on the responsibility to heal the wounds of a divided nation, urging the people to begin a new chapter. As a young man in his 30s, he had already become aware of America's image-making as global policy, a fundamentally American version of big lie techniques devised in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. There, Arendt argues, lying was guided by ideology and backed by terror. Here, it has been directed at creating images and bolstered by hidden persuasion through the manipulation of public opinion. A parallel, then and now interestingly, Mr. Biden, in keeping with the intellectual leanings of the 1960s and the 1970s, had begun to think at a young age of Arendt as a contemporary philosopher speaking on the idea of image and lies, on disinformation, on violence, on public and private freedom, and on political action. It was the war on terror, on Afghanistan and Iraq that echo Arendt's report on the Holocaust organizer, Adolf Eichmann, and his trial, which derives its significance from the complex notions of justice and responsibility, ethics and duty. The war, for instance in Iraq, or a few decades earlier in Vietnam, was not in support of defending democracy and human rights but to exhibit the power and might of the American hegemon. The fabrication of the hypothesis of weapons of mass destruction was exposed when no such lethal nuclear arsenal was discovered. The sham left both the United States and Britain red in the face. Setting policy right, Mr. Biden had early on in life learned from political philosophy that the rise of a more workable political and public humanism depends singularly on Arendt's free spectators of action who determine the meaning of action and its public relevance that saves humans from the abyss of a miserable existence. No wonder Mr. Biden has taken keen interest in pressing humanitarian issues such as Sudan's political crisis or the dark contemporary history of Syria. He has already introduced a national security team designed to repudiate Mr. Trump's nationalistic isolationism in order to usher in humility and confidence among America's allies. His choice to execute the nation's immigration policy is a Cuban-American, Alejandro Mayorkas. Avril Haines will be the RST woman to serve as Director of National Intelligence. And possibly Lloyd Austin would be the RST African American in America's history to head the Department of Defense. As Mr. Biden's choice for Interior Secretary, Deb Haaland will be the RST Native American Cabinet Secretary to ensure that the nation would make right the wrongs in the long history of bloodshed and extermination of the natives. This counters not only Mr. Trump's misogynism but also his agenda of withdrawing shamelessly from America's role in the world as a defender of democracy and human rights. Aaron's castigation of Zionism and the fascism of the American-supported Israeli leadership brings us to the question of how authoritarian regimes fail to notice the lack of any sense of ethics or humanitarian necessity. It is true that biological racism that is visible in the history of apartheid, or in Germany under Nazism, or the resurgence of racist politics under Mr. Trump subsists on the major ideology of enforcing complete submission of the individual self to the state. The evil of incorrigible megalomaniacs striking out at the very dignity of being human. Schooled in Arendt's writings on totalitarianism and the nature of the human condition in times of crises, Mr. Biden is the right choice for president who hopefully has the vision for an exceptionally progressive change. It is expected that he will constantly be on his toes with the same readiness as Barack Obama, and alive to what George Santayana warned. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Writings that inspire America must know that politics of terrorism will not work anymore at home or abroad. And it is hoped that many around the world would go to Arendt if only to learn a lesson or two about the vulnerability of our democracy that allows people like Mr. Trump to even stand for election when he is guilty of allowing thousands to die of the pandemic. Her writings have always been a powerful foundation of inspiration to the people's movements fighting against totalitarian lying and the infringement of basic human rights. Her persistent warnings of failure of the American Republican tradition for self-government asks for an ideological position underpinned by a more cognitive existence that is mindful of the facts coming home to roost. For Arendt, if you remain an onlooker and express no reaction appropriate to the circumstances, your inertia will amount to deliberately perpetrating violence and accepting lies to prevail. Flu in flight. The avian you must be stopped before sustained transmission among humans. Just 3 months after India declared itself to be free of the avian influenza outbreak, the highly pathogenic avian influenza subtypes, H5N1 and H5N8, have been reported from a dozen epicenters in 4 states: Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Himachal Pradesh, and Kerala. In addition, thousands of poultry birds have died in Haryana, while Jharkhand and Gujarat, too, have sounded an alarm. The cause in these 3 states is still unknown. The 2 subtypes have targeted errant birds, crows in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh, migratory birds in Himachal Pradesh, and poultry in Kerala. While tests have confirmed H5N1 for causing the deaths of over 2,000 migratory birds in Himachal Pradesh, H5N8 has been identified for killing thousands of poultry in Kerala, and hundreds of crows in Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh. In a bid to stop the spread, as on Wednesday over 69,000 birds, including ducks and chickens, were culled in Alappuzha and Kottayam as per India's 2015 National Avian Influenza Plan. Other states have been asked to be vigilant of any unusual deaths or disease outbreak signs amongst birds, particularly migratory ones. Migratory birds have been largely responsible for long-distance transmission of the virus into India during winter. It then spreads through local movement of residential birds and poultry. Movement of men and material from poultry farms too has been a cause for further spread. This is why states have been asked to strengthen biosecurity of poultry farms, disinfection, and proper disposal of dead birds. With backyard rearing of poultry birds common, the task of elimination will be particularly difficult. A recent European Food Safety Authority report says 561 avian influenza detections were made between August-December in 15 European countries and the UK. The virus was predominantly found in wild birds, and a few in poultry and captive birds. H5N1 and H5N8 were two of three subtypes found in Europe. Genetic analysis helped confirm the spread from Asia to West Central Europe, suggesting a persistent circulation of this virus strain, likely in wild birds in Asia. While avian influenza virus crossing the species barrier and directly infecting humans happens occasionally, human-to-human spread has been rare. But mutations or genetic reassortment of an avian influenza virus and a human influenza virus in a person can create a new influenza virus that could likely result in sustained transmission between humans, thus increasing the risk of a pandemic influenza. Hence, all efforts should be directed at stamping out the outbreaks in the United States. It is also important to undertake genome sequencing of virus samples to track the evolution of the virus.